Good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 7th of November, 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike. Mike is scheduled to be back on Monday. So yesterday, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that she's going to retire from Congress ahead of the 2026 election. There's a political historian at Boston University named Thomas Whalen, and he said that Pelosi's retirement could cause what he called a domino effect. And this would be an increasing pressure on some older Democrat Party politicians to consider retirement. And this includes Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. And Whelan said the Democratic Party base has become impatient with some of these older Democratic leadership after the 2024 election. This is also what has been motivating Senate Democrats to vote down this continuing resolution in the Senate and keep this government shutdown ongoing, which there's supposed to be a vote today again on that continuing resolution. I think it's likely to fail, and the shutdown will continue into next week. Because there have been a lot of Senate Democrats now, as I mentioned yesterday, pushing for Democrats to get a guarantee from Republicans that this Obamacare subsidy, COVID-era Obamacare subsidy, will pass in the Senate and the House and not be vetoed by the White House. And I think that's due to a lot of this pressure, especially on Chuck Schumer. As we reported earlier this year, there were some of the more progressive and Democratic Socialist parts of the party that have been putting pressure on Schumer to either resist fully the Trump administration or retire and allow a younger person to run for his Senate seat in New York. Moving over to Maryland, yesterday there was a statement put out by Joint Base Andrews Air Force Base that a building on the base was evacuated after an individual opened a suspicious package, and several people in the building were transported to an on-base medical center with an unknown illness. I did see that those people have been now released from the hospital, and the site has been cleared, but it is now under investigation by the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations. And according to CNN, two people who are familiar with the investigation said that the package contained an unknown white powder, and OSI investigators are assessing what they call political propaganda that was included in the package. So this looks like a potential hoax Anthrax attack on the airbase. And this is, I think there's also important to point out that Joint Base Andrews is where Air Force One is stationed when not in use. And this is not the first of these types of anthrax hoax attacks that have been directed at federal officials. I think we reported on a few weeks ago or a month ago that there was a similar anthrax hoax attack at the ICE field office in New York City. Also, airlines today are beginning the cuts to their flight capacity. And the FAA issued their emergency order last night for U.S. airlines to begin cutting flights today. And this emergency order also allows the FAA to decline air traffic control services for airports when adequate staffing is not available. According to airline scheduled data for today, so far 3% of U.S. domestic flights have been canceled. And the FAA emergency order that was released last night also requires airlines to phase up to 10% cuts by next week. Also yesterday, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker said that Illinois officials are watching what Indiana does with its mid-decade redistricting push, and that in Illinois may have to react if Indiana does pass this new congressional map. So it looks like we are still going to see more states push these mid-decade maps. As reported yesterday or earlier this week, some Republican states have put a pause temporarily, like Kansas, on trying to get a new mid-decade map and are going to attempt to pass a new map in their normal state legislative session starting in January. Washington State and Oregon officials have sent trade delegations to China in the last month, apparently to meet with Chinese trade officials, and their goal is to maintain economic ties while the Trump administration and some other state governments have been restricting trade to Chinese investment at the state level and the federal level. And Oregon State Senate President Rob Wagner told Chinese media during one of these trips that Oregon is committed to working with China. According to a group called the U.S.-China Business Council, their president, Sean Stein, said that he expects more aggressive outreach from some of these state governments to China in the near future. All right, Jerry, if you could come on and take us through the global sit rep, please.
Absolutely. We're going to start off the fighter jets associated to the Ford Carrier Strike Group, which was redeployed from the Mediterranean down to the Caribbean, or should be en route to the Caribbean. They were reported off the coast of Morocco yesterday, which is over on the west coast of Africa. And the White House briefed Congress that land strikes in Venezuela are not imminent. There's some question about the legality of it, and they're trying to sort that out. And over in Brazil, the special advisor for international affairs to the Brazilian president said that Brazil must defend South America when choosing between the United States and Venezuela. Now, this special advisor also claims that this doesn't actually undermine Brazilian President da Silva's attempt to mediate between those two other states. There were a couple of major war preparations that happened over in the Pacific this week. China commissioned its third aircraft carrier, and the Japanese now considering moves in order to increase military retention, other military buildup there. And the European Investment Bank has made some pretty significant investments into Lithuania specifically. They just announced another 300 million euros, which is about 10% of Lithuania's annual armed forces budget. So that's significant in its own right. But that's actually even not all of it. In 2025 alone, they've invested €1 billion. So that's about a third of Lithuania's total annual budget.
All right. Thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on. We are tracking 373 protests over the weekend, which is significantly below baseline for the past few months. Weekend protests. And we are then now going to move over to the high side, where we are going to talk about a potential crackdown on anti-ICE protesters at some of these ICE facilities, and also New York preparing for a federal surge after Zohran Mamdani's mayoral election win on Tuesday. If you want to join us on the high side and get access to our analysis and our questions and answer session, you go to forwardobserver.com/trial, where you can get a 7-day free trial. All right, Jared, take us to the high side, please.